German prisoner kept his eyes locked on the American. Dust still clung to his uniform, sweat ran into his collar, and his stomach rumbled with hunger. Then, with almost casual indifference, the American soldier reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a cigarette, lit it, took 2 slow drags, and flicked the half-smoked stick into the dirt. The German's eyes widened. His mind screamed as if he'd just watched bread squandered in a starving village. Back home, a cigarette like that was treasure. A half-burnt butt could be traded for butter, for a slice of bread, even for warmth on a cold night. But here, in the hands of an American, it was nothing, not even worth finishing. To the German, a cigarette was survival itself. To the American, it was a background hum, as common and forgettable as the dust cloud kicked up by his boots. Smoke curled in the air above both men, one staring in disbelief, the other marching on unconcerned. That tiny vanishing wisp carried a message heavier than any bullet. Here was a nation so wealthy, so resource-rich, that even its luxuries could be burned and discarded without a second thought. The prisoner's heart sank. If Americans had cigarettes to waste, what else did they have in endless supply? Ammunition, food, tanks. The realization began to spread, curling through his mind like smoke in still air. This was more than culture shock. It was proof of power. And soon, he and thousands of other German soldiers would learn just how deep that difference ran. The year was 1942, and for the American soldier, a cigarette wasn't a luxury. It was equipment. Open a ration box, and there it was. Chocolate, canned food, chewing gum, and nestled right beside them, 4 cigarettes. Not a treat, not a bonus, but a guaranteed inclusion. From North Africa's dusty camps to the damp foxholes of France, smoke wasn't just common, it was expected. For these men, a cigarette was as essential as a rifle, just another part of the uniform. This wasn't an accident. The U.S. War Department had joined forces with the tobacco industry in a sweeping partnership, ensuring that every soldier, from frontline infantryman to rear echelon clerk, had a constant flow of smokes. Tobacco executives boasted in patriotic advertisements that their factories were going to war alongside the boys overseas. And they weren't exaggerating. American factories churned out hundreds of billions of cigarettes each year, tens of billions earmarked solely for the military. The message was clear. Cigarettes were morale in a box. They steadied nerves before battle, calmed shaking hands after a firefight, and provided moments of quiet routine in an otherwise chaotic world. In the mud-soaked silence of a foxhole, the flare of sulfur, the drag of burning tobacco, the shared exhale of a platoon, it all became ritual. Small paper rolls transformed into lifelines. At home, propaganda only reinforced this bond. Glamorous posters and tobacco ads showed smiling soldiers lighting up, framed by captions declaring smoking to be part of courage itself. A Camel advertisement boasted that it was the brand most chosen by Army men. Lucky Strike made headlines with its wartime packaging change, claiming its distinctive green dye had been sacrificed for the war effort, though in truth it doubled as brilliant marketing. Families were reassured in newspapers that their sons not only had food and bullets, but their favorite brand of cigarette, right there at the front. To many Americans, cigarettes became shorthand for democracy itself. Every man deserved them equally, general, captain, or private. Puffs of smoke blurred the lines of hierarchy, letting soldiers bond across rank in those moments between orders. A pack offered, a lighter flicked, a shared breath. It said more than words ever could. For an army that drew from every class and corner of the United States, this mattered. Behind this abundance was a vast machine of production. Factories in North Carolina, Virginia, and Kentucky ran day and night. Tobacco wasn't rationed like sugar or butter. Quite the opposite. It was prioritized. Congress and military planners considered cigarettes critical to morale, and morale was inseparable from victory. Industrial might rolled from assembly lines not just in the form of tanks and planes, but in endless crates of Lucky Strikes, Camels, and Chesterfields. But hidden within this culture of plenty was an unspoken reality. Abundance meant waste. A soldier could light a cigarette on the march, puff twice, and toss it aside the moment orders came. Another might finish half, stub it out, then immediately reach for another minutes later. The ground around American encampments was often littered with butts, half-smoked and crushed into mud. To the soldiers, it was background noise, just part of camp life. They barely noticed the casual discarding. They didn't realize those casual flicks, those trailings of smoke from half-used cigarettes, were broadcasting more than habit. They carried a message as visible as any battle banner. America had resources to spare, more than enough to burn. And far away, in Germany, men were counting out their last scraps of tobacco, stretching a single cigarette over a week or piecing together smokes from dried leaves and newspaper. Officers guarded their supplies. Enlisted men traded and begged for puffs. Cigarettes weren't equalizers in the Reich. They were privileges, symbols of status, bargaining chips that might mean an extra crust of bread. For now the Americans smoked endlessly, unconcerned. But soon their enemies, captured, starved, and thrust behind barbed wire, would see this firsthand. They would watch this ritual of abundance, this carelessness with tobacco, and feel something deeper than envy. They would see proof of an economy that outproduced not only bombs and tanks, but even the smallest daily comforts. And for German prisoners of war, nothing would astonish them more than discovering that, to an American, a cigarette wasn't a prize to be savored. It was expendable. The cultural collision was coming, and with it, the first whispers of despair. By 1941, the story of cigarettes in Germany became one of scarcity. Scarcity that crept into the trenches, into barracks, and into daily life until smoking was no longer routine, but ritual. The German soldier on the front line never assumed he'd have enough tobacco for the week, sometimes not even for the day. Every ration mattered. Every puff carried weight. The ration books told the story clearly. Officers received priority, their rations larger, and distributed more frequently. The enlisted men. They were often left with scraps, the unlucky ones finding only crumbs of tobacco in weekly distributions. And when shortages bit deeper, those distributions themselves shrank, forcing rank-and-file soldiers to improvise. They tore newspaper strips, rolled dried leaves, even scraped together hay. Some even tore pages from small books, fashioning them into crude smokes that burned harshly and fast. These makeshift cigarettes left throats raw and lungs heavy, but the act of inhaling, of grasping at the sensation of relief, was still worth it. Cigarettes, precious as they were, became more than a habit. They became survival currency. A cigarette could smooth over arguments among men living shoulder to shoulder under fire. It could buy an extra slice of bread. It could sway a supply clerk into offering a better work detail far from the blood-soaked front. Officers hoarded them, leveraging packs for obedience or loyalty. In some camps and units, cigarettes decided fates more effectively than money ever could. The deeper Germany sank into the war, the thinner these rations stretched. Allied bombing cut transportation and crippled factories. Tobacco imports slowed to a trickle as naval blockades tightened. Every cigarette that reached a soldier by 1943 felt like a treasure smuggled through fire. Men learned to make one cigarette last over several days, sometimes smoking only half, then carefully stubbing it out, saving the rest for tomorrow. And yet, for all this desperation, the act of smoking still mattered. A wisp of smoke became defiance, a small pocket of normality amid chaos. Entire platoons of soldiers huddled together, sharing one cigarette passed down the line, trading not just nicotine, but camaraderie. The last man took drags from nothing more than paper ash, but still clung to the ritual. It was less about escaping nerves and more about maintaining a shred of humanity. Civilian Germany wasn't spared either. Families rationed their home supplies, bartered useful goods for even a few precious packs. On black markets in Berlin or Munich, a single cigarette could trade hands multiple times a day, swelling in value as its paper thinned with every drag. Housewives offered bread for smokes. Workers offered favors. In a collapsing economy, paper currency grew meaningless, but a pack of cigarettes was as real as gold. The disparity inside the Wehrmacht was sharp and bitter. Officers striding through towns with full packs in their breast pockets, while regular soldiers pawed at the ground searching for discarded butts. Some soldiers grew resentful, quietly noting in diaries how unfair the system felt, how morale sagged under the weight of endless shortage. What little comfort they found usually came by tearing apart leftover cigarettes, re-rolling the shreds into new, smaller ones, thin, fragile recreations of a habit that once held steady dignity. For those on the front, smoking was not casual, it was not plentiful, it was desperate, a ritual stripped bare by scarcity. Each soldier knew cigarettes were running out faster than the Reich's promises could replenish them. And in the back of their minds, many began to wonder, if tobacco was this scarce, what did that say about other supplies the Army needed to keep fighting? By late 1943, comparisons became inescapable. Rumors trickled in, borne on stories from prisoners traded or intercepted letters. Whispers that American soldiers had rations too, but theirs included not just full meals, chocolate and soap, but cartons of cigarettes. Men spoke in disbelief, shaking heads at tales of Americans smoking easily, tossing butts away. At first, the rumors felt like exaggerations, soldiers' tales stretched beyond reality. Could any army afford such waste? And then, some German soldiers saw it with their own eyes. On the battlefield, in moments of surrender, or while being marched to camps, they noticed how casually an American GOI smoked, lighting one cigarette after another, dropping half-finished sticks into the mud as if they meant nothing. Watching this felt like witnessing sacrilege. For men who had stretched one cigarette to last 3 days, the sight carried a weight far heavier than envy. It felt like a revelation. If America could afford to waste cigarettes so freely, what else could they afford to waste? That question lodged itself in every German prisoner's chest, lingering long after the smoke itself drifted into the air. Soon enough they would learn the answer, not from rumor, but from direct experience, because captivity was waiting. And inside America's POW camps, German soldiers would discover what true abundance looked like. The column of captured Germans shuffled forward in silence, their boots dragging through the dust of North Africa. Their faces were masks, exhaustion, fear, bitterness, every man wondering the same question: what awaited them behind the barbed wire of an American camp? Stories had traveled fast about what happened to prisoners. Some expected violence, others braced for humiliation. Hunger, they all assumed, was guaranteed. They passed through the gates, surrounded by guards who looked shockingly relaxed, laughing among themselves, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Then came the moment. With almost no ceremony, an American guard reached into his pack, pulled out a carton, shook loose a handful of cigarettes, and tossed them at the crowd of prisoners. Not bread, not water, cigarettes. The Germans froze. For a heartbeat they thought it was a trick. Some refused to touch them, suspicious that tobacco might be poisoned, a cruel joke to break them down. But it wasn't. The Americans waved casually, motioning to light up. The guards, themselves puffing away, seemed confused at the hesitation. Did the prisoners not want them? One German reached forward, trembling, picked up a cigarette, and lit it. The smoke filled his lungs, and just like that, the spell was broken. Others scrambled, desperate not to miss out. Soon the air above the intake yard was streaked with white plumes, German prisoners tasting not just tobacco, but something even more intoxicating, relief. The first drags left many dizzy, coughing. These were men who had learned to ration scraps of paper-thin smokes for weeks who had gone months without inhaling a proper one. Now, without effort, cartons appeared, as though conjured from thin air. In the corner, a guard flicked away a half-burnt cigarette, indifferent as it landed in the dirt. A group of prisoners darted forward, scooping it up like treasure. One of them pinched the stub, carefully unrolled it, saved the tobacco, and re-rolled it for later. To them, this was unthinkable. Americans discarding what in Germany could buy bread, butter, even loyalty. Rumors had trickled across the front before, the unbelievable stories of GIs tossing cigarettes away mid-battle, of rations stuffed with smokes. But rumor was one thing. Seeing it with their own eyes was another. Prisoners whispered frantically, passing the revelation along. This wasn't just a gesture of kindness. It wasn't even just about morale. It was proof of something far bigger, that America produced on a level the Reich could not imagine. Days into captivity, the gifts of cigarettes continued. American guards handed them out during roll call. Red Cross parcels arrived with chocolate soap and multiple packs of Camels or Lucky Strikes tucked inside. The air of suspicion began to fade. The prisoners realized it wasn't manipulation or trickery. It was routine. Cigarettes weren't just luxuries here. They were ordinary, expected, endless. For the Germans, it twisted the mind. In their own camps back home, officers rationed cigarettes like jewels, handing down crumbs while trading favors for full packs. Here, in enemy hands, common guards tossed cigarettes away by the handful, as if they were no more valuable than pebbles. It was humiliating and comforting all at once. Humiliating because it exposed how poor and stretched the Reich had become. Comforting because the abundance dulled fear. If Americans were this generous with luxuries, perhaps captivity wouldn't be as brutal as they had feared. And everywhere, the waste cut deepest. Lines of prisoners watched GIs smoke 3, 4, 5 in a day, lighting one with the butt of another. They dropped half-burnt cigarettes into the dirt when orders called them to move, discarding them as though they were nothing. German eyes tracked those glowing ends constantly, knowing back home each one would have been bartered for soup or protection. In some camps, prisoners began scouring the ground after guards left, collecting discarded butts to re-roll into fragile new ones. Even in abundance, their instincts of scarcity lingered. Yet that very waste carried a darker message. If Americans had smokes to burn casually, endlessly, what else did they have in such bottomless supply? Food, ammunition, planes, and tanks? The realization settled heavily among the captives. This war wasn't being fought on equal terms. The camps kept confirming that fear. Trucks rolled up daily with crates of supplies, cigarettes stacked like firewood, enough to light every man in the camp 10 times over. Prisoners couldn't reconcile it. Back home, bombings throttled factories, supplies choked by shortages. In their world, nothing was guaranteed, not fuel, not meat, not tobacco. But here, it appeared the Americans had so much they barely noticed when they gave it away. The clash of cultures was no longer rumor. It was experienced every day, with every flick of ash. And in the long, quiet nights inside barbed wire camps, those smoke-filled moments pressed on the Germans' minds. Cigarettes weren't just comforting, they were evidence of a world where America could outproduce even in trivial luxuries, a world the Reich could never match. The lesson was dawning. This wasn't about tobacco anymore. This was about power. And on the horizon, that power would soon reshape not only the camps, but the lives of every prisoner inside them. Inside the barbed wire of America's prisoner of war camps, something unexpected happened. Life reorganized itself, not by rank, not by nationality, not even by rations of bread or soap. It revolved around cigarettes. What began as casual gifts from American guards soon transformed into an entire economy as intricate and ruthless as any marketplace in Berlin or Munich. Cigarettes became money. A single smoke could buy a bowl of stew from a fellow prisoner. A whole pack? That might earn you a wool blanket for the winter nights in Oklahoma or Colorado, where the cold crept into every barrack. To some, one cigarette was worth more than half their food ration. Hunger gnawed at stomachs, but the craving for tobacco, combined with the habit and its value, was stronger. Within weeks, a hierarchy emerged, not based on military rank anymore, but on cigarettes. The wealthy prisoners were those who managed to squirrel away multiple packs, usually officers who had better access or those skilled in trading with Americans. They smoked leisurely, lighting up in front of others to flaunt their status. Across from them, the poor prisoners scavenged in the dirt for discarded butts, scraping half-smoked ends into fragile paper rolls to stretch the last fragments of tobacco. Some prisoners discovered opportunity in this new economy. They became bankers, hoarding cigarettes in hidden caches under floorboards and behind barrack walls. A man without smokes could borrow from them, but repayment always came with interest. 3 back tomorrow for every 2 today, whispered the informal moneylenders, and desperate men agreed, knowing withdrawal meant humiliation. The web of debts spread quickly, drawing camp life into a fragile system of trust and survival. Alongside the bankers came artisans, prisoners who painted, carved wood, or stitched uniforms, suddenly found their skills worth something. They offered portraits of fellow inmates, carvings of miniature horses, handmade tools, all for cigarettes. Even humor became a trade. A storyteller or a singer could earn smokes for an evening of light-hearted distraction. What outside the wire seemed like worthless talents inside became measurable in tobacco, but with economy came control. Those who had cigarettes commanded respect. They could gather allies, offer bribes, or avoid the worst work details by slipping a pack under the right hand. Those with none sank into desperation, often trading away half their food just to get one smoke, feeding an addiction that was more powerful than hunger itself. Letters, diaries, and testimonies years later revealed this strange truth. Men starved themselves thinner, willingly exchanging bread for tobacco, chasing the ritual of smoke curling between their lips over the comfort of calories in their stomachs. The Americans noticed. Guards chuckled at the lengths prisoners would go. They watched entire poker games unfold not with cards and chips, but with cigarettes stacked tall, fortunes rising and falling with each hand. A man could be wealthy at sunrise, owning 20 smokes in neat rows, and broke by midnight, left with no more than a torn scrap of paper rolled in desperation. For the U.S. Army, this phenomenon became useful. Cigarette shipments equaled leverage. A guard who held the key to their distribution quietly controlled morale. When tensions rose, cartons were handed out, calming agitation faster than any threat of punishment could. When cooperation was needed on work details, additional smokes smoothed over resistance. Cigarettes were diplomacy, in its quietest, most effective form. Inside the camps, it reshaped identities. Some prisoners defined themselves by their ability to smoke freely, holding court with a cigarette between their fingers like a badge of authority. Others grew resentful, scavenging constantly, ashamed at their dependence on discarded American butts. This division created rifts not tied to loyalty to Germany, but loyalty to this new economy. For the Germans, the irony was sharp. Back in the Reich, cigarettes already carried value on the black market, fueling trade in bombed-out cities. Yet here, under guard on foreign soil, that same system reappeared spontaneously, as if tobacco was destined to become currency wherever scarcity and desire collided. But to the Americans, it reinforced a different truth. To them, cigarettes had little more weight than pocket change. They were cheap, abundant, endlessly replaceable. The sight of Germans clinging to them, trading, hoarding, fighting over them, confirmed the imbalance. The guards knew what the prisoners learned slowly and painfully. America's capacity to supply was bottomless, so deep that even luxuries became tools of control. As time passed, the invisible line between smoker and non-smoker deepened. Men who could light up daily grew calmer, bonded in small circles of smoke-filled camaraderie. Men without struggled, restless, irritable, sometimes desperate enough to gamble their last possessions away for a single cigarette. Survival in camp wasn't only about meals and shelter, it was about the ability to spark a flame, inhale deeply, and let the smoke remind you of control. And so, inside every POW camp emerged a quiet world where the value of life could be measured in puffs of smoke, where cigarettes meant status, meant security, meant hope. Behind the barbed wire, Germany's prisoners quickly understood they were not just captives of war, they were captives of an economy they could neither match nor escape. But even as prisoners adjusted to this camp currency, they had yet to see how cigarettes could be used in a way far more powerful and even more disorienting. Soon they would learn that behind interrogations and interactions with guards, cigarettes weren't just money, they were persuasion. The German prisoner sat stiff in his chair, eyes darting nervously across the interrogation room. The American officer leaned back, calm, almost casual. There were no fists slamming on tables, no shouted threats. Instead, the officer reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack of Chesterfields, and slid it across the rough wooden surface. The silence stretched. The German hesitated. Accepting felt dangerous, even dishonorable, but his hands betrayed him. Shaking, he picked one up. The American lit his own, then leaned forward and, without words, lit the prisoner's cigarette too. For a long moment, they simply smoked together. No accusations, no violence. Just two men sharing the simple crackle of burning tobacco. And when the American finally spoke, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The walls felt less like a cage, the conversation less like an interrogation. Slowly, the prisoner started talking. This was cigarette diplomacy, America's silent weapon behind the wire, more powerful than intimidation, more effective than hunger or deprivation. The offer of a cigarette wasn't just charity, it was psychological mastery, a gesture simultaneously disarming and respectful. It made the captive feel human, made him relax, and in the haze of trust, information slipped loose. Again and again, reports from the time tell the same story. Cigarettes softened hostility and bridged divides where suspicion once ruled. In some camps, interrogators began every session with the same ritual. Light one for yourself, offer one to the prisoner, then talk. Manuals quietly encouraged it as a tactic, not because tobacco was mystical, but because it reshaped the battlefield of the mind. Even outside the interrogation room, the cigarette became more than smoke. Guards and prisoners, men who had once been enemies on the battlefield, found themselves sharing moments of uneasy camaraderie through smoke breaks. A GI leaning against a fence, smoke curling from his lips, offering one across the divide to a German through the wire. It turned enemies into men, if only for a flickering instant. For the Germans, the memory of scarcity never left. Lighting up in American captivity felt surreal, almost unbelievable. They wrote home about it, smuggling letters describing the endless supply. Some marveled at the generosity. Others admitted they had distrusted it at first, convinced it must be some trap. But as days turned to weeks, the truth became undeniable. The cigarettes never ran out. Cartons kept arriving, guards kept handing them out, and the suspicion slowly faded. The accounts of these prisoners reveal the strange duality of the experience. On one hand, smoking together reminded them of home, of a ritual that stretched back before the war. On the other, it carried an inescapable sting. In Germany, they had rationed cigarettes, hoarded every fragment, treasured each drag. Here, in enemy hands, cigarettes were so plentiful they became mere tokens of goodwill. What was a tightly guarded treasure in the Reich had been reduced to small talk in American camps. And yet, the effect ran both ways. For young American guards, often barely older than the prisoners they oversaw, the ritual of lighting up together blurred the line of hostility, too. They talked about hometowns, about girls, about music, not in formal interrogation rooms, but standing near gates or barracks separated by barbed wire, two former soldiers puffing smoke under the same sky. Moments where the war's cruelty seemed to collapse into shared human routine. The most powerful weapon wasn't the cigarette itself, it was the symbolism, the act of offering one, the act of accepting. It was a message tucked into rolled tobacco and paper. You are not just a number, you are still a man. But beneath these moments of quiet bond was a deeper, sharper truth. Cigarettes demonstrated abundance, not equality. To Americans, handing one away cost nothing. To Germans, accepting one felt like proof they were living on the enemy's charity. It confirmed, every time, the imbalance of the war. One side smoked because they could. The other side smoked because their conquerors allowed them to. Stories of these encounters survived long after the fences came down. Former prisoners recalled with startling clarity the moment a guard wordlessly handed them a cigarette, the first time they realized captivity might not mean endless brutality. Some admitted those gestures reshaped how they saw their enemy. Others wrote decades later that every puff reminded them of how vast the gulf of resources had been. The paradox remained unresolved. The same cigarette could comfort and humiliate, bring calm and reveal weakness. Every inhale seemed to carry warmth. Every exhale seemed to whisper, "You lost." Even so, Germans kept smoking. They kept writing home in astonishment about the smoke-filled air of American camps, where soldiers wasted cigarettes so carelessly that prisoners could collect piles of discarded butts. They described the haze above the fences as surreal, a constant cloud that never cleared, proof of a supply chain their homeland could never rival. And as the days stretched into months, the lesson grew steadily heavier. Cigarettes weren't just currency, they weren't just comfort. In American hands, they were tools of control, persuasion, and quiet dominance. Neither threats, nor fists, nor chains had brought the prisoners to talk or comply as effectively as the faint glow of a lit match, the soft inhale, the shared silence that followed. The simplest ritual carried immense weight. In the crucible of captivity, smoke had proven to be sharper than steel, yet the final test still awaited. For when the war ended and captivity gave way to freedom, the question remained: what would all these cigarettes leave behind when the smoke finally cleared? Germany in 1945 was a graveyard of stone and silence. Cities were reduced to skeletal ruins, factories gutted, rail lines severed. Hunger stalked through the rubble, while civilians scoured fields and forests for anything edible. And into this shattered world returned hundreds of thousands of former prisoners, German soldiers who had lived behind American barbed wire, men who had seen an abundance their homeland could no longer imagine. And many of them carried back more than memories. They carried a craving. For these former POWs, American cigarettes had become part of their identity. The brands were etched into their minds: Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields, every name tied to long days of captivity, to smoky poker games, to interrogations that blurred into conversations. Returning home, they found a Germany where tobacco was scarce, production crippled, and improvised smokes rolled from leaves, and newspaper were the new normal. To men used to cartons stacked casually in American camps, the contrast was staggering. But in the ruins, they discovered a new economy that spoke their language. Cigarettes, specifically American ones, became literal money. A single carton of Lucky Strikes could buy a month's worth of bread. A few packs could secure fresh clothes or a night in a warm bed. In shattered Berlin, black market stalls whispered with offers spoken in low voices, deals made not in Reichsmarks, but in smokes. In Munich, Frankfurt, Hamburg, the story was the same: Pockets bulged with cigarette packs more often than coins. Paper currency was distrusted, nearly worthless. But American tobacco? That everyone understood. The Allies knew it, too. Cigarettes flowed freely in occupied zones, handed out to soldiers, filtering into civilian hands. GIs carried cartons like casual tips, sometimes trading them, sometimes handing them away as gestures of kindness. Entire streets could change mood if one soldier passed out a few extra packs. Children marveled at the sight of the white sticks, associating them not with vice, but with survival. For civilians, securing a few packs meant heat, food, clothing, the very building blocks of daily life. For the former prisoners, the black market cigarette world felt uncannily familiar. They had already lived this economy inside American camps, where fortunes rose and fell one puff at a time. Men who had learned the power of cigarettes under foreign watch now re-entered society with the same instincts, spreading that camp-born knowledge into the cities of a broken Reich. And quickly, post-war Germany became a nation trading in smoke. But with the return of cigarettes came something else: addiction. Years of habit, intensified by captivity, left many prisoners chained to tobacco. They lit up not just because they craved it, but because of what it symbolized. Every puff carried echoes of their time behind wire, of the guard who had slid a pack across a table, of the unexpected humanity in a shared drag. For many, smoking was memory as much as habit, a ritual that stitched their war years, their imprisonment, and their new uncertain lives together. The legacy was bittersweet. On one hand, cigarettes were remembered as symbols of generosity, small luxuries that softened the hardest edge of prison life. Acts of kindness between enemies often came wrapped in paper and tobacco. But on the other hand, the same cigarettes left scars, addictions that lasted lifetimes, illnesses that claimed thousands in the decades that followed. The cigarette generation wasn't forged in peace, but in war, shaped by the ashes of battles as much as by the smoke that drifted from soldiers' lips. In the end, POWs remembered America not only for its tanks, its aircraft, its staggering arsenal, but for something far quieter. The endless plumes of smoke rising from cigarettes, the Americans seemed to burn without thought. To German eyes, it was the final symbol of abundance, proof that America's power reached so far it extended even into luxuries. For a nation returning to ruins, it was a haunting contrast. German cities starved, families rationed crumbs, and yet American soldiers could scatter cartons across markets as if dropping pebbles into the ocean. To many, the sight stung deeper than the weapons of war themselves. Cigarettes were not just luxuries. They were signals, symbols of a world so rich it could spare even its smoke. And perhaps that is the most striking legacy of all. When the guns fell silent, when prisoners made their way back through the rubble, the memory that lingered sharpest was not always of artillery or air raids. It was of a half-smoked cigarette flicked into the dirt by an American soldier, glowing faintly for a moment before disappearing into ash. To Germans, it was more than tobacco wasted. It was a message that they had fought against a country whose strength wasn't measured only in bombs and bullets, but in the smallest details of daily life, even smoke. And smoke, as it turned out, could tell the story of victory just as clearly as firepower ever could.